you don't know me, my name is Liz McEntee and I'm Chair of EDAS and delighted once again to be hosting this event on behalf of our organisation in partnership with the Scottish Government and COSLA and led by CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. So it's great to be back again with Neil, Chief Executive of CLES, to lead this session as well as a wide-ranging range of really interesting, I think, and informed speakers this afternoon. And these include Linda Gillespie, Cost Programme Manager with DTAS, Simon Poole, Managing Director of Gerba Campervans, Shona Glenn, Head of Policy with Scottish Land Commission, and I'm delighted to say a recent appointee to the EDAS board, and Martin Avila, the Director of the Kinning Park Complex in Glasgow. So welcome to all of our speakers, welcome to all of you. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. I'll say a bit more by way of introduction to each of our speakers as we move through the agenda. But as I say, today is our fourth session in a series of 5 that will focus on inclusive ownership, land and property, and specific case examples of these with regard to community wealth building. And obviously this builds on previous sessions that we've held, where if you were attending those, you'll know that in the first session we looked at the theory and 5 pillars of community wealth building. In the second section, we really are looking at how to put community wealth building into action. And the last session that we had just about a month ago was all about the role of community anchors. Now, again, the recordings of all of those sessions are available on the EDAS website if you missed them, so well worth a look. And as I do at each session, I just want to reiterate the aims that EDAS has in bringing these sessions to you in partnership with CLES. And it's really twofold. I mean, the first one and the main one is obviously to provide you with access to first-class experts and expertise and people who can share knowledge and tools on community wealth building. But there's also another aspect to it as well, and it's really about trying to link you to a community where you can build relationships, where you can have conversations and make connections out with these events, so that as you take forward your work in community wealth building, you're able to, share ideas and collaborate in terms of the work that you're doing in your own locales. So in terms of today's session, don't feel you have to take copious notes. You'll be sent a recording of the event, as well as any slides that we present today, and obviously details of the chat box commentary. We're also going to try out and include some breakout group sessions today, and you'll have the opportunity for a bit more interaction and feedback beyond the confines of the chat box, which we've had in our previous events. So we'll see how that works as we evolve our online approach, and hopefully that'll work well. It'll save Neil having to pick on people from the audience, although that may well still happen. As ever, we've muted participants except for those who are speaking, but you can add any comments throughout the session at any point in the chat box, and we'll do our best to pick up on each of those and have a chance to respond. As I say, we've scheduled usually about 2 hours for this, so really going to try and keep to time and try and keep the speakers on board in terms of their timing as well. And we'll take a short comfort break around about 3:20, just so we can take a break before we do the breakout session. So once again, great to have you here, and over to you, Neil, to begin the session, which I believe is going to be starting off with an overview of community wealth building powers in the context of ownership, land and property. So there you go.
Thank you, Liz. Excellent stuff. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll get straight into the specific speakers. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap, if I may, because we have got about 1/5 of you who are new to this community wealth building thing. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap, and then I'll go a little drill into a little bit into inclusive ownership and land and property, and then over to the speakers. So let me just share my screen, and hopefully it will work smooth enough. And can you see that okay, folks? Liz, thumbs up.
That is good.
Fantastic stuff. You still see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm Neil McEnroy. I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies with the UK's national organisation for local economies, and we've been spearheading and helping the growth of community wealth building across the UK and elsewhere for a good wee while now, and maybe 10 years or so. Also worth mentioning, just for I'm also seconded to the Scottish Government 2 days a week as a community wealth building advisor in the Economic Development Directorate. A little bit of a recap then, just the key thing here is, what is community wealth building? It is, in a sense, a maturing of economic development with a core focus about growing social and environmental benefits into all economic activity. This is about hot wiring the social, the local economic, and the environmental right in to the actual function of the economy. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. Of course, we're familiar with redistribution of wealth. That's when we get the economy to grow, and then through taxation and so forth, we re-transfer that wealth to people, to public services and so forth. Community wealth building is about that, but it's the added extra. It's saying, can we think about how the economy, when the economy actually functions, when the economy is actually in operation, that we're hot wiring in these social, ecological, and local economic benefits, not after growth, not after everything's been done and dusted, but during the actual economic production. And in that, ownership of land and property and ownership in the economy is key. Not just people getting their just desserts, if you like, from being workers, but actually having a genuine stake in land and the wealth that's held in land and in economic activity. So that, in a nutshell, is community wealth building. I won't bore you, but that's just for those that are unfamiliar perhaps with the term and are new to these series of workshops. There is a rollout going on in Scotland as we speak. North Ayrshire was the pioneer in community wealth building. That started in 2019, and now we have an action plan for Clackmannanshire. We have an emerging action plan for Western Isles. That will be done in the next few weeks. South of Scotland has just begun. Tay cities, we have an action plan for Fife, and Glasgow City region now has emerging some action plans on particular aspects of community wealth building, and that's being conveyed to GCR tomorrow. That is coupled to a whole range of other stuff in terms of mainstreaming community wealth building within Scotland and the Scottish Government, and of course community wealth building features in the programme for government, and optimistic that moving forward with any new administration it will still feature as a key aspect of Scotland's economic development. Here's the 5 pillars of community wealth building. I'm not going to talk about them again in any detail, but of course today we are drilling right down into the people, the great people that are out there doing stuff around inclusive ownership and socially productive use of land and property. The great thing about our great nation and the people in it is that community wealth building is nothing new in particular. We're doing some things. What we're seeking to do is to amplify and scale the really good progressive stuff. With any elements of these pillars, we're doing stuff in Scotland. There's no issue about not being able to not doing it. The issue is doing it at scale and making it the mainstream in terms of how we think about what our economy should be and who it works for. We did that in session 1, that whole bit about the pillars. In session 2, we talked a little bit about theory of change and the process by which we're talking about here in terms of community wealth building. What community wealth building is about? It's saying, let's not overly plan and in a research way. What community wealth building says, good stuff are happening. Yeah. How do we start from what we've got? We're aiming to have flow of wealth back to local economies, places, and more control to local people and businesses. How do we work back from that goal and do things with what's in front of us? Not procrastinating, not creating a big, huge industry around this. It's actually about working with what's in front of us. Mony a mickle, max a muckle. Many a small thing makes a lot, and that's a key tenet, if you like, a key mission and what we're trying to do in community wealth building in Scotland, this theory of change model. Changing the world, if you like, by doing. Changing Scotland by doing stuff. There's a range of anchor organisations we talked about in the second and a bit of the third session as well, about the role that these public sector anchor organisations have in place. They buy stuff, they own land and property, they have workforce, they are key elements in the Scottish economy. 35–40% of the whole Scottish economy is driven by the public sector in various guises. That's an important lever, not the only lever, but it's an important lever to think about in community wealth building, as we talked about in previous sessions. So now getting into the two pillars today in detail: inclusive ownership, land and property. Just a little bit of a opening gambit before we get we bit Linda in to talk in the first speaker. How long have I got, Liz? Have I got 2 or 3 minutes left? I don't want to.
Yeah.
Great.
You're okay. You're okay.
The first one is land and property assets. There's key things to think about here. Firstly, how do we value land? Yeah. What is the value of land and how do we achieve it? Now, the issue we have with land and property is that it's awfully commodified. It always seems to have financial return. Can we start thinking about the wider social, cultural, ecological, and local economic return on our land and property? And that first picture there is the River Park in Seoul. I won't begin to know how to say it, but anyone who's been to Seoul, you should, or you'll be planning, if we get out of lockdown and get to travel and we get to go to places like South Korea, go to that place. It's amazing. It was an urban motorway, yeah, like the M8 in Glasgow. And what did they do? They knocked it down and they built an urban park, an old underground waterway. They revealed right through the heart of the city. And that was because they appreciated that there was more to the value in the city than real estate value. There was a value in that well-being. There was a value in that lung for that beautiful city. So value is important to think about here in land and property assets. And then I'm interested in history in this context as well. If you think about our clearances, the clearances, that was people who didn't own the land, who are tenants, who could be easily uplifted and say, we didn't want you anymore, we're going to have some sheep instead. And we were banished elsewhere in Scotland and also the Scottish diaspora as well. So the link between economics and land and democracy and having a say is really important. So ownership's important in that. Economics and democracy should be intertwined. And when we don't have a say in the economy, then people can take it and abuse us and what our livelihoods. So we need to have economics and democracy linked together, and our history tells us that. And of course, people are on this game, and we'll hear from Shona and Martin later, of course. But obviously, work like the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force in Scotland, fantastic stuff, pushing on ideas of land ownership, land stewardship, and wider questions of value in our land and property assets. And then we have the other area of, I want there's a subsequent point really in this question of land and property. We're thinking about all that in the green zone there, different forms of ownership and stewardship, which is the space between the owning by the public sector, owned by the private sector, what is commonly referred to as the commons. How do we actually grow and enhance and amplify the commons when we think about land and property assets? And then inclusive ownership. We're doing great stuff in Scotland as part, and we'll hear from Linda and Simon on this. And this is basically the notion that says, if we have an economy where there's a greater level of us, the people and communities having a stake in the economy, then we'll get better social, ecological and local economic outcomes. We know that small local firms generate 58% more benefit for local economies than large firms. They employ local people, more likely to employ local people, more likely to have local suppliers. And if those small local firms make a buck, they're not good. They tend not to invest that money in the Cayman Islands or Dubai. They'll invest it in the localities in which they do business. We know that inclusive ownership models as well have fairer distribution of profit and income, the more equitable working practices, and importantly, relate to places and communities. And this is what we're talking about then in this inclusive ownership paradigm. Final point I'll make, and then I'll shut up, is that in inclusive ownership, we need to think about commercial, social, and public economic activity and ownership. And the real prize here, the real prize in inclusive ownership, is not just transferring public ownership to community ownership. The real prize here is how do we deal with making inclusive ownership more deeper and stronger within the commercial private sector economy. That's the real prize, because that's where wealth is extracted. We need to see a growth of inclusive ownership models in our private sector. That is the real prize, not just swapping from public sector activity to social. There's useful in that, but the real big juicy prize is how do we stop wealth extraction from the commercial sector by growing social economic activities within our economy and economies. Right, that's enough from me. I'm going to shut up and then I'm going to pass you back to Liz, who will introduce the first speaker.
Okay, thanks, Neil. That was great, and thanks for doing the overview as well of what we've kind of covered so far. Just a reminder for people. Our first invited speaker today is Linda Gillespie, who is a cost program manager with DTAS. Can I just ask, is anyone else hearing an echo here just now? Yeah, I don't know if we can do something about that from a technical perspective. Apologies, I don't know why that's happening. It's not happened before. So I'll just continue and hopefully it seems to have faded. That's fine. Okay, so in terms of Linda, with an early career in the private sector, where she was responsible for multiple retail sites across the UK, Linda moved into economic development, initially in a business advisory kind of role. Over the years, Linda has worked with hundreds of community-led organisations and social enterprises, and she's seen at first hand the positive benefits of ownership of assets and what that can bring to communities, improving the sustainability of their organisations, protecting and developing services, and creating jobs. Within her current role at COS, she has a particular interest in exploring the underlying enterprise models and innovative options for sustaining community assets in the future. And just to be clear, Linda, COS stands for Community Ownership Support Service. That's right, I've got that right, haven't I? Sorry, you're muted. You go. Yeah. Okay, so Linda, lovely to have you here. So really looking forward to what you're going to share with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Alison, would you be able to share my slides, please? That's great. Thank you. I've been asked to do a short session on inclusive ownership. So that's, as Neil had kind of highlighted, developing and growing more social and local enterprises that are more financially generative and relate more to communities, lock in wealth into local places. And this includes social enterprise, cooperatives, development trusts, and municipal enterprises. I kind of felt that it would benefit from actually just articulating the scale of this in Scotland. So could we go on to the next slide, please? So kind of referencing the social enterprise in Scotland census in 2019, which was produced by the Social Value Lab and facilitated by CEIS. I mean, Scotland has a very healthy social economy in the third sector. I mean, what's not to like? Social enterprises are, after all, businesses with a social and environmental purpose that lock in their non-profit distributing and they reinvest in their communities or their social purpose. So there's thought to be just over 600,000 social enterprises currently operating in Scotland. This is from 2019, employing just over 88,000 people. And 33% of those social enterprises are located in rural Scotland. It is kind of it's worth unpicking that because actually large urban areas are home to the kind of majority of social enterprises with 67%, and obviously the major cities have a kind of high proportion of the activity related to that. But within that, overall, 20% of social enterprises are in remote rural locations. So they're immensely valuable to those communities that house 6% of the population. And I'm sure there'll be kind of very close links when we look to the Western Isles pilot and community wealth building. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Could I have the next slide, please? So just the kind of last of the key facts from the census. So an end income generated from trading activity, we'll bounce forward one, could we bounce back please? From earned activity of 3.1 billion. Interestingly, and this was a trend that's been picked up in England as well, 79% of social enterprises are selling directly to the private sector. And actually the proportion that they're selling to the public sector is declining, with currently at 53%. It was noted in this census that only 18% of those surveyed had won a contract, a public sector contract in the last year. You see, you're getting all in my way of my dizzying stats, all truncated. So I'll just keep going with my other one. And currently 75%, and this is the key one when we talk about this, 75% of social enterprises pay the living wage, pay all their staff the living wage. They recruit locally, and actually the pay differential has remained consistent. So it's like 1 to 2.5. So that's the difference between the highest paid employee and the lowest. So in terms of a sector, Scotland has a very vibrant social enterprise sector. There is a strong preference to it being service industries. So 75% of social enterprises operate in that field. So that was kind of an overview from that census. Obviously, what a difference a year makes. The next census, it will be very interesting to see how the sector has responded to COVID in terms of its sustainability. Now, I work for the Development Trust Association Scotland, and if possible, Alison, could we go back to the last slide? Development trusts are generally classed as community anchors, but not necessarily within the context of community wealth building, but they are regarded as community anchor organisations. So they're independent, community-led, they're defined by a geographic community, and they're democratically accountable to that community. They're multi-service delivery, so there are a lot of very good organisations out there that are delivering single services, but that doesn't make them a development trust, and they take an enterprising approach. The vast majority own assets or manage assets from which they leverage and deliver their services from. So coincidentally, DTAS surveyed its own members in 2019, and if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So out of the 270 members, DTAS members, they employ just under 1,400 people. There are just under 9,500 volunteers assisting in the delivery of services, and they own assets estimated at £165 million. Now, the vast majority of those assets tend to be community hubs, service facilities, those types of assets, but increasingly communities are looking at productive assets. So there are piers, harbours, marinas in that mix. There are large land holdings. There are renewable energy projects which generate the surpluses and reinvested in the communities. And there's £31 million of earned income through trading activity. So the network is growing. We're now at 310 members. And actually new members are joining all the time. So I just thought I would finish finally on the other side of our organisation, which is our community shares team. So if we could go to my final slide, that would be great. This is, so community shares, and I suppose I just wanted to kind of highlight the change in terms of how people are viewing this. This is the second phase of Community Shares Scotland. So community shares are issued on the basis of community benefit societies. So community benefit societies have a view on the whole society and the whole of the society in the first instance, in addition to their members. And there's been quite a shift between the phases in community shares, with the kind of first wave being typically kind of renewable energy projects, those types of things. But if you look at this last phase over the last 3 years, the difference in the types of assets and projects that communities have an interest in, with those productive assets like pubs and shops coming to the fore. And actually that geographic split shows the kind of focus on remote communities recognising their kind of need to play an active role in these types of projects. So total shares capital raised just under £4 million, but that £4 million has been able to leverage just under £15 million across 22 share offers. with kind of 7,364 members. I would say that my colleagues in Community Shares are exploring a range of really quite interesting and challenging share issues, and they've never been busier. So we are at a kind of, it feels as if we're at a kind of really interesting point in the development of the sector and community ownership within it. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Linda. That's really interesting, and again, just really good to see how community enterprise, how social enterprise, and development trusts, that whole movement is kind of growing and thriving. Can I just check though? It's just over 6,000, isn't it? 6,025 social enterprises, because I think maybe.
What did I say?
I think you said 600,000. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's quite a leap since the last time I was working in that field. But well, if you've achieved that, that's quite something. But 6,000 is nonetheless a very impressive figure. Okay, so if we move on to our next speaker, we now have Simon Poole, who's founder managing director of Gerba Campervans and based in North Berwick. This organisation was formed in 2006. And is a recognised partner of Volkswagen and has a workforce of 14. And they build and supply new VW campervans to customers across the UK. And I would imagine right now there's never been more of a demand for that, given the limitations that we're all experiencing and the emphasis on staycations. In January 2018, Simon transferred all of the company shares into a trust, and Gerba Campervans became 100% employee owned. Now this move was driven by a commitment to the long-term preservation of jobs and a desire to have an impact on wealth inequality and to protect their local communities. So really interested in this very real live example from you, Simon, that's clearly very pertinent to what we're talking about today. So over to you, and thank you for being here with us.
That's okay, Liz. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and interesting to listen to Linda and see some of the comparisons, and listen to Neil as well and see some of the comparisons in how I see the structure of Gerba Campervans, and it's an employee-owned model and how it all fits together with community wealth building. So there's our logo these days, and I'd like to be absolutely upfront about our ownership. So on our main logo it says 100% employee owned, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, and it's becoming more and more a subject of interest to customers. Customers comment on it all the time, and now often make very positive choices in choosing us because of our social outlook and our company structure. So I'm going to talk about, I'll tell you a little bit about, just briefly, who we are as a business. I'll then briefly talk about, for any business, if they have choices for what's going to happen in the future of the business from an owner's point of view, what are those choices for business succession? I'll talk about the employee ownership model, so you can really understand what it is and how it works, the impact that model then has on community wealth, with some examples of how I feel we have as a business impacted, and then what's available on the advice and support for companies that are thinking of going down this route. So what do? We build campervans. Liz said we were accredited by Volkswagen, which we are. So there's a typical view of a camper van that we build, and there's a view of the workshop, just to give you an idea of some scale. That's about half the workshop. There's another section to the left as well. So it's a busy old place. Based in North Berwick, we have customers throughout the whole of the country, and we sell direct to the public. So we don't sell through retail outlets and garages and agents. Everything we do is straight from us to the public. Started it, and it was myself who started it on my drive with a bag of spanners and some other rusty tools back in 2006, and formed it as a private limited company with myself and my wife each holding 50% of the business. So that's how we started it. Turnover in 2019 was 2.7 million. I think it's useful to get an idea of scale here. Employees, I think they said 14, it's 13, but I guess it depends on whether you look at individual employees or the full-time equivalent. So full-time equivalent is 13, and we became employee owned in January 2018. So we're now 3 years into the employee owned model. Right, so the top line here, 16,000 Scottish business owners want to retire within 5 years. Very few have a plan. That's straight from the Scottish Enterprise. And I do a number of talks, I guess, on an annual basis with Scottish Enterprise through Cooperative Development Scotland. I'll mention them at the end, who are helping businesses go through this process of becoming an employee-owned business. So this is one of the statistics which one of the representatives from Scottish Enterprise always says, and it's quite an interesting one, because if you want to retire from your business, and particularly if you are the person who founded it, or you're the person who holds the shares, or you are there's a small number of you who are the major shareholders, you need to have a plan. If you suddenly decide I want to retire in 6 months' time, actually, in many businesses, that's an extremely difficult thing to do in an effective manner, which protects the jobs of the people who are there, and it's the private sector, gives people a fair return on the effort and the investment they may have put into a business over many years. So if you're in that position, you have a business, you think, well, I want to retire in, and I would always say we did this process 5 years ago. I'm not looking to retire, but we wanted to look about how we could possibly restructure and have the business ready for the future. The options on the table were a trade sale, so that's selling the business to another private company. And we looked at that, and I pretty well dismissed it instantly. Too many times I see, and have come across in my research and looking into it, the smaller business is consumed into the larger business, and a lot of the time people's jobs are not protected. As a business owner, you often end up in long, protracted negotiations, and you often end up in a situation where you have to do what they call an earn-out period. And you'll find for that earn-out period, you're working for somebody else for a year, for 2 years, possibly more, and the whole culture of the business can change. Most times I've spoken to people who've been through it, it's quite a negative experience, not just for the person who's selling the business, but also for the people who work there. And quite often a lot of people leave the business and go to look for work elsewhere. So many times I think it has a negative impact on the employees and consequently on the local economy and the local community. It may be that the person who owns the business makes the most money out of it, but that's, in my view, that's not what it's all about. Management buyout, you have to have somebody in your business who can finance or has the connections to finance management buyout. And in the business that we have here, Joburg Camper Vans, that was never going to be the case. So that opportunity wasn't there for us. If it's a family business, you could pass it on to your family. Another stat that Scottish Enterprise always say is, I think it's 5% of family businesses survive 3 generations. So passing it on to your family is not always a good way to protect the business and protect the jobs of the people who work for you. Just because somebody's your cousin, your son, your brother, whoever, doesn't mean they can run the business. Liquidation is always an option if you have a lot of assets, but if it's a profitable business, that would be a crazy thing to do, because again, you're putting people out of work. So I thought really employee ownership from our point of view was by far the most sensible and the best option for Joburg Camper Vans. So how does the model work? You basically form a trust, and the trust has to own 50% of the shares plus 1. So it has to have a majority stake in the business. The purpose of the trust is there for the long-term benefit of the employees. So the trust is, well, the company is one. The company still exists as a company. So you still have company and the company directors, and then you have a trust with trust directors. So the company is there. That hasn't changed. The company directors carry on running the business. The trust doesn't suddenly run the business, but the trust is there, if you like, as a checking point for the company employees. So to the company directors, rather, to make sure that the company is being run for the benefit of the employees, and the beneficiaries of the trust are the employees. How does the vendor, the person who's selling the company, receive any return from that? Well, mostly they would do it through what's called deferred consideration. So the company makes profits over a period of years. Normally, it would be about 5 years you'd be looking at, and during that time, the value that you have agreed for the business, you would look to have that paid back within that period. The benefit to the seller is it's tax-free. if you were selling a company, normally capital gains tax, they've now changed for, there used to be a thing called entrepreneurs relief, it's changed a little bit, but you'd normally pay 10% on the first £10 million, now it's only £1 million, I say only, but the tax structure has changed. But there is an incentive there for people to do this. The other side of the coin is, vast majority of times you will receive less for the business than you would if you sold it in a private structure. So a good indication would be somewhere around possibly 60% of the value of the business. I always think is a good mark to say, well, that's probably what you'd value it at if you're going down the employee ownership route, and you would probably look to try and see whether you could have that paid off within a 5-year scale, roughly. And on the employees, the trust board, we have employees. So we have on ours, we've got 3 people. We've got an elected employee, so the employees can put their names forward to be elected, and then there's a blind vote, if you like. We have an appointed employee, so we appoint an employee, and then we have our accountant, who's an independent director. So as company directors, we report to the trust board. That's myself and my wife, and ultimately they're there to what's called, as they hold your feet to the fire, to make sure you're running the business for the benefit in the long term of the employees. One of the benefits in pure financial terms to the employees is every year they can have up to £3,600 in a bonus tax-free. They pay national insurance at the employees' rate, but they don't pay any income tax. Over 3,600, you start to pay income tax at your normal rate, but it allows the company to distribute money each year, if there are profits there to do that with, to employees in a tax-efficient manner. And this has happened most definitely here. Yes, we had an open structure, and I've always had a policy of the office door is open, come in, tell me your ideas, and let's all do this together, which is the kind of culture that business has. But if you start to look at hard stats, there are proven increases in employee-owned companies in productivity, in innovation, and employee retention. That's just 3 I chose there. So the turnover of employees is extremely small. We hardly have anybody leaving the business. So how does this all impact on the community? Well, the most important, I've again chosen 3. You could probably write a long list here. Protecting local jobs, and in turn protecting the local communities for the long term. Just the tax structure in itself makes it unlikely that you would sell an employee-owned business that is owned by a trust, because there's been tax breaks to allow the business to turn into that model. If you then were to sell it, you would be charged capital gains tax on the sale of the business, and then the employees would be charged income tax on the distribution of the monies. So you get hit twice for tax. So what if a business does extremely well and somebody approaches an employee in business and says, I want to buy you, the initial figure might sound great, but after you've been taxed on it, it doesn't sound that great at all. So it's a real disincentive for employee owned businesses to be taken over by another business. And I think that's great because it protects the business for the long term. It reduces inequality. We talked there about distributing profits, and the 3,600 is not a cap. It just says above that amount, then people pay income tax at their given rate. So in the situation we are at the moment, the business became employee owned in January 2018. We have a forecast that says, well, by January 2023, the business, just from the profits it makes on an annual basis, will have been enough to buy out myself and my partner, who are the original founders. But even at this stage, we're still paying bonuses to people on an annual basis. I saw little point in setting an employee-ownership model up and then saying, but there's going to be no benefit to anybody else here apart from the fact that I'm protecting your jobs. No financial benefit for 5 years. That to me seemed like a complete disincentive. So we already started paying bonuses. So this year people will receive £3,000 in a bonus. The company is still paying us back. So I think it's getting a balance between having monies paid to you as an owner, but also making sure that people really do see something in their pocket for the commitment they put into it. And then the employee well-being. We have a number of working groups within the business, small business, but we have little working groups, and one of them we've called Valuing People. So that is asking people in the business, what is it like working here? How could it be better? And that could be in the physical environment. There are things which you might assume yourself aren't important, but other people might find extremely important. Unless you ask them, you never know. So little things, working in a workshop, there aren't many windows. Actually, having windows in a workshop will make a massive difference to the well-being of the people who work there. So we have these open forums where people can really put forward their views to say, what's it like working here? What could be better? And understanding the cost of such things will have an impact on the profits and an impact on the distribution of profits. So everyone starts to become much more interested in, well, I'd love to have this, but it costs that. So they really become an integral part of the business and understanding and are being fully behind decisions that a business makes. We also have now as well, it's stalled a little bit because of COVID, we have a policy, if you like, where every year we give 2 or 3 days of our time individually or as a group to local community projects. So we ask the employees, well, who would you like to support? What organisation would you like to support locally? So we really want to try and make a difference. Now, we're not trying to sell any camper vans. It's not going to add to the profits at all. It's time out of our working day. But I think it's important. It's good for it's good for the local community and the people who receive the help. It's good for the guys here as well, who team building, yes, but also to feel they really are putting something back into the local community more than just being here and spending their money locally. And I'm a firm believer as well is that particularly in the industry or the sector I'm in here, where we're taking on manually skilled people. Some of them may not have done particularly well at school, but that doesn't matter. What they are really good at is working with their hands. And some of them I know have had tough upbringings where their confidence has been dented day after day because they've been told they're not good enough for this and they're not good enough for that. So by giving them something in a way for nothing builds their confidence and builds their self-esteem. And I'm 99.9% sure they take that back with them into their community. So they see things from a different way. They value items more possibly than they used to. You know, they don't buy the tools here, but they own the tools. If they have an expensive tool and they're careless and they break it, it's costing them money, it's costing everybody money. And I really do believe that that becomes just an attitude, a belief, a culture within them, which they take back into their community. And I'm not going to suggest people behaving badly, but I think it does have an impact on the way they see things in their community and how they then interact with other people and the knock-on effect that comes from that. So I think from a well-being point of view, I think it's extremely interesting. And advice and support. So I mentioned at the start Scottish Enterprise. So there is an individual part of Scottish Enterprise called Cooperative Development Scotland, CDS. And they support companies through, this is a direct quote from them, transition into employee ownership, as well as other cooperative and community-based business models. I think it's important to say employee ownership is not just one model. Myself and my wife, my partner, we transferred 100% of our shares. So everything is owned by the trust. It can be 50% plus a little bit. You can have, there's a whole array of models. I won't try and go into them now. You have direct and indirect ownership. Cooperative Development Scotland are experts on that and will talk people through that. So if anybody you know, companies that are local to you who you think this might be applicable to, but you're not sure, there could be a model which suits that company. It doesn't have to be 100% employee owned. There are models that are in the middle. And just to give you some idea of scale within Scotland, and Scotland has more employee ownership businesses per head than England does by quite a long number now. So there's 120 employee-owned businesses in Scotland, and just in the past 12 months, there's been 20 new companies added. And I said right at the start when I talked about our logo, COVID-19 has definitely focused, I found, with the customers that we talk to, people's minds on social responsibility. The number of times now that people say to us, and I would say it's probably virtually every single time if somebody is buying a vehicle off us, buying a camper van, they say, we came to you, yes, because we like your product, yes, because we like your service, but also because we love the way the business is structured. So it's socially responsible, but in my view, it's also really good business sense. because you're giving yourself a marketing opportunity over the competition. We have competitors who do vans which are just as good as ours, but they have a private enterprise model where the guy at the top, whoever it is, the lady at the top, is the one who's taking the vast majority of the profits. And when people as consumers are presented with a similar product where they see fairness and they see equity, then increasingly they really are starting to choose that. So I think now is the time to be talking to people about employee ownership. So as to say, in your roles across government and other associations, if you think there are employee ownership possibilities out there, then I'd really encourage you to raise it as an option. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. To have the echo again. What's happening? Are we okay? Yep, is that better? Yeah, I think that's better. Simon, thank you so much. I think you really brought that to life for everybody here in a really kind of real and pragmatic way. And I really hope you're right. I have a sense of that too. That, you know, COVID has given everyone a chance to kind of reflect on what's important and the importance of giving back and making sure that you are supporting local businesses and looking at what the economy holds going forward. So that was really, really interesting. And likewise, Linda, I think in setting out the context for all of this, that was a really good lead-in for what Simon then said that followed. So thank you both. In a similar vein, we're now going to move on to the land and property context. So we've looked at community ownership, inclusive ownership. So we're now going to take a look at land and property. And I'd like to welcome Shona Glenn, who's Head of Policy at Scottish Land Commission, to give us the kind of overview on that part of the agenda. Shona is an economist with a professional background in economic development. She started her career working in local government, then spent some time in private consultancy, and now she heads up the policy and research team at the Scottish Land Commission. She's responsible for the Commission's work on vacant and derelict land and was closely involved in the recent work of the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force. And I know, because she's on our board, that she's really passionate about the need to tackle inequality and build an economy based on human well-being, and believes that putting land really kind of back in almost at the centre of the economic model will help us to do that. So Shona, again, delighted to have you here today. So if you are ready to go, I think we've still got slides from Simon's presentation, so it may be that we need to just sort that quickly.
Share my slides, but I'll need somebody to let me know if you can.
Yeah. Are you have slides, Shona? Yeah.
I do. Can you see it coming up?
Yep, I think that's coming up now. Great. Okay, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Liz. Right, so fascinating talk so far. It's been really interesting. Neil has asked me to start off by sort of making the big picture connection, I think, between Scotland's land and the economy. So where I'm going to start is actually, it's really by stating the obvious, to be honest. It's pretty clear to me, and I think a lot of people, that Scotland's economic model isn't really working at the moment. And I think the experience we've all been through over the past sort of year really just confirms that. But if there's one thing that I think has emerged from that and that is positive, it's this really strong appetite for change. It's an enormous appetite for change, and I think you can make that case on moral grounds. But actually, I don't think that's how we should be doing it. You know, I could easily sit here and sort of tell you all about social inequality and rail against environmental degradation, but actually, it's not going to make any difference, because the people who need to listen, they're not going to listen to that. I think we really need to be making the case on economic grounds. And as Liz said in the introduction, I firmly believe that land is at the heart of that case. There's really three reasons why I think that. Firstly, because of the relationship between land and inequality and the economy. Inequality is not just a moral issue. There's really strong body of international evidence that says that inequality is directly linked to suboptimal economic outcomes. The second reason is because of the relationship between land and climate change in the economy. And we've all heard the statistics about the economic consequences of ecological damage. I don't need to repeat them. And numbers of that scale can't be ignored. But the final reason is, and really links into today's discussion, is really to do with the link between land and place in the economy and the need to act local to solve global challenges. So I'm going to come on to that in a minute, but before I do, just a little bit more on the role of land in all of this. Why does land matter? First of all, it matters because land is a huge component of wealth, and it's disparities in wealth that really drive inequality. And I think the figures on this slide actually are a little bit out of date. There's been new statistics released fairly recently, and actually the portion of the UK's net wealth that's locked up in land has actually gone up. I think it's now at about 57%, and that is just land. It's not the housing that sits on top of it. So if inequality harms the economy, which we know it does, and land is a major component of inequality, then it stands to reason if we want to fix our economic model, we've got to look at how the benefits from land are distributed. So, that's the one reason. The other reason, land is going to be absolutely critical in the fight against climate change as well. In May 2019, the Scottish Government received advice from the UK Committee on Climate Change about the action that Scotland needs to take to play its part in delivering against international climate obligations. And in providing that advice, the committee set really quite an ambitious target for Scotland to achieve net zero by 2045. Now, that's fully 5 years ahead of the rest of the UK. And the reason that Scotland has been set a more ambitious target is because of our land resource. We've got the capacity to do more and to do it more quickly than the rest of the UK. So if we want to tackle inequality, we want to tackle climate change, actually, we've got to put land back on the agenda. And if we want to do that, I think we need to think locally about how we do that. And I was tempted when I was putting the slides together to call this Think Global Act Local, but I didn't because I thought you'd all think that I worked for a bank, and that's not really my image. But it is true. We've got to think global and think local, act global. If we want to fix these big global challenges, we need to get the most of our land, and that doesn't mean doing a few things really well or putting together a few big, impressive projects that everybody gets really excited about. It's about really maximising the potential of all our land, not just the bits that are obviously wasted, but actually the bits that don't seem to be causing an obvious problem as well, but could be more than they are. And I know that's a really big ask, and that's why we're not going to do it with the top-down approach. We're only going to succeed if we tap into the potential of communities. And we need to empower them to take action to really realise the potential of their places. To do that, I think we need to get better at recognising value, recognising what value looks like. I don't mean value in the sense like a real estate sense. I mean real value. Think the things that get people excited about their place. What is it about a place that really means something to somebody? And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's a really powerful motivator. People will work incredibly hard and deliver amazing things if it means something to them, if the place means something to them. But it's also important because I think it can help us to be a little bit more imaginative about what the future potential of places is. Because if we can see things from somebody else's perspective, it might just help us to come up with solutions that we might not otherwise have thought of. Because what I think is valuable might not be what you think is valuable. So that's kind of the big picture stuff. And that's why land is important. But in a way, that's kind of the easy bit. Actually, the difficult bit is taking that and working out what it actually means for policy, what it means for practice, and how you apply it, how you actually translate it into real things that people can actually do. I think we need a framework to help us with that. And the framework I would propose is something called the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. Just as a wee aside, it would be really helpful just in terms of the Land Commission and baselining work we're doing for future evaluation. If anybody has heard of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, if you know what it is, if you're familiar with it, please could you just stay in chat. It'll help us with a bit of baselining we're doing. What it is, the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, it does exactly what it says in the tin. It's a statement of everybody's rights and responsibilities in relation to land. It applies to urban and rural land, and it applies everywhere in Scotland to everybody. It's got 6 principles, and I've put those up on the screen there, and I'm not going to read them out, but I would suggest that they provide, if you look at what's in them, I would suggest they actually provide a pretty good framework for delivering a lot of the kind of things that we're going to need to deliver if we're going to realise the community wealth building agenda. We haven't worked out exactly what that might mean yet for local economic development, but there are quite a lot of lessons that I think we can draw from our work to date. And if we put that together with the learning that's coming out of the pilots that Neil mentioned earlier, and the other good work that's going on the ground around the country, I think what we'll end up with is a pretty strong blueprint for the land bit of community wealth building. So I'm just going to run you through a few bits of our work that we've done over the last couple of years that I think can help us build that blueprint. And the first thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is community ownership. There's loads of anecdotal evidence out there about the benefits of community ownership. And I think anybody with any of the experience of working with these kind of groups knows just how powerful it can be as a way of transforming places and transforming people's lives actually as well. But I think what we haven't really done terribly well yet is link that positive experience with community ownership back to the macro level. And I think the key here is a link to human capital. So this is, I'm going to get a little bit theoretical here, apologies, I find this stuff fascinating. There's a really strong thread in economic theory that suggests that growth in post-industrial societies tends to be driven by accumulation of human capital, so skills and your innate capacity to, as a human being, rather than physical capital. So one thing that we know community ownership is really, really good at is helping to build human capital. And that's something I think we really do need to better understand. And that links directly, I think, to another really important theme that's emerged from our work over the last couple of years, which is that community ownership is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And I know that sounds really obvious to people who are kind of already involved in this stuff, but actually it's not so obvious to a lot of people outside the movement. But once you realise that, I think you begin to realise actually it's not all about, or not always all about, community ownership. It's really about diversifying the pattern of land ownership. And that could mean a whole range of collaborative, cooperative, shared governance type arrangements. I mean, you know, including the kind of thing Simon was talking about a minute ago, actually. We did some research last year on this, and we found that these models were actually much more common overseas than they are in the UK. Other countries don't have a special category called community land ownership, not because it doesn't exist, not because it's not important, but because actually it's so normal that people just don't really talk about it. And I think that's where we need to get to in this country. So how do we do that, and what does it mean for economic development? I think there are probably a couple of really important points that we need to make here. Firstly, I'd like to see all public bodies have a really honest look actually at how they're approaching community asset transfer. Can all public bodies really hand on heart say they're making it as easy as they can for communities and giving them as much support as they need to succeed? You know, I think, you know, probably we can all do more. The second thing, which is much less well thought out, I think, is that I think we really do need to explore alternative models of ownership and control and come up with some really imaginative solutions that would enable communities to take on more control of assets without necessarily having to take formal title. So this is something we're going to be looking at over the next couple of years. So just a bit of a shout out, if anybody's interested in working with us on this, please do get in touch. I want to talk about, which Liz mentioned in her introduction, is our work on vacant and derelict land. We've done a huge amount of work on this area over the last couple of years, and as some of you will be aware, the Land Commission convened a national task force a couple of years ago now to look at this. The task force reported back last year and made a whole series of recommendations about what we need to do to transform Scotland's approach to vacant and derelict land. Now, it's really important to understand that those recommendations weren't just for government, and it contained recommendations for all sorts of people, all sorts of different agencies. And we are going to be doing more work this year to raise awareness about that. So I'm not planning to go into the recommendations here, but I have included a hyperlink in the slide. So if you haven't seen the recommendations, if you haven't looked at them, I really would encourage you to have a look. And if you don't have time to read through the whole report, that's fine. Just skip to the end, and there's a really handy table right at the end that summarises all the recommendations and suggests sort of who should be doing what. But the bit I want to draw out today, it's really the big focus for the task force was on vacant and derelict sites that are really stuck. You know, the ones that have been hanging around for decades that just aren't going anywhere, and there's next to no hope for any kind of commercial development. And the work of the task force, we identified about 600 of these sites across Scotland, and that's just the ones that have been registered. But a third of those are owned by the public sector. Right? To me, that is a massive opportunity. Now, I know these sites, a lot of them have real challenges, but our work suggests that actually if we can change our mindset and start thinking about these sites as opportunities rather than just problems, and really harness the power of communities to help us tap into that potential, then those sites can not only become the foundation for community wealth, they can also help us tackle some of those really big global challenges that I was talking about at the start. So the final area of our work I just want to touch on, common good land. In a lot of ways, actually, common good land can be seen, or common good property can be seen as the original form of community ownership. And it was originally intended to provide the old boroughs with space that they needed to, you know, construct civic buildings and hold markets and graze livestock and all of that kind of thing. And it was given legal status back in 1491 with the Common Good Act, and that created an obligation that these assets should be managed for the benefit of the citizens of the borough. That Act is still in force today, so it's still the same Act, the 1491 Act that's governing Common Good today. But today, Common Good is believed to be worth hundreds of millions of pounds. Nobody's quite sure how much because the records are, well, a bit sketchy. But the vast majority of that value is accounted for by land and buildings. And for many people, there are questions about how those assets are managed and whether they could be put to better use, and you know what the purpose of Common Good is in the 21st century. So I think there's a really obvious connection there to community wealth building. How could we modernise governance of Common Good so that rather than being this kind of archaic thing that nobody really understands very well, it becomes a foundation for really thriving and resilient places? So I don't have the answer to that yet, but we are planning to do more work on this in due course. And in the meantime, we've just published a protocol as part of our programme of land rights and responsibilities that sets out expectations in regards to the management of Common Good land. So I'd really encourage you to have a look at that and think about whether your organisation is meeting its obligations, whether there's more you could do to really make sure that we're making the most of these assets. So I'm just going to wrap it up there. I kind of like finishing with this slide sometimes because it's just a wee reminder of where we've come from. This was a headline in The Spectator about 6 years ago, and that's where land reform was at that time. It was seen as a purely rural issue. It was solely about land ownership. It was confrontational. It was angry. It was politicised. I think that's changing. I think those perceptions start to change. Land reform isn't just about righting past wrongs or addressing grievances. It's about having a grown-up conversation about how Scotland can make the most of its land and how it can do that in a way that creates an economy that really does support human well-being. So I think that was.
Okay, Shona, thank you so much. Again, really, really interesting presentation there. And I think highlighting a whole range of resources that, you know, if people aren't familiar with them, you know, we can certainly signpost everybody to. We'll make sure that we have links to the various documents that you were referring to there. The Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, I think, was the first one. Obviously, the Vacant Derelict Land Task Force, the work that was done there, and the protocol on Common Good Land. But I think for all of you here, you know, I think you heard a very welcome and open invitation from Shona for you to, you know, be in touch, to have a dialogue, to connect with the Land Commission to see where this can be taken. I should also add that, you know, at EDAS, we've been working on developing a new strategy for the next 3 years. We're very much looking at expanding, and in a sense, our definition of economic development and looking at where well-being, looking at where land, looking at where you know, ownership, community wealth building, all of these things sit with economic development and kind of broadening the basis of the work that we're taking forward. So Shona, thank you so much. I think that's been really, really helpful and tees us up nicely for our next speaker, who is Martin Avila, Director of Kinning Park Complex in Glasgow, which is a community anchor organisation. And for those of you who don't know, Kinning Park Complex was the first organisation in Glasgow post-Community Empowerment Act to take land and buildings into community ownership. And I would have to say, showing great tenacity and determination in the process, as I recall. They're now one of Scotland's one of the first in Scotland, rather, to begin work on the local place plan. Martin's also a board member of SURF, Scotland's Regeneration Forum, and a treasurer of Community Land Scotland, the national membership organisation representing Scotland's community landowners. So he has a real wealth of experience and knowledge to bring to today's event and dialogue. And again, building on the overview there that you had from Shona, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Martin, from a specific case study perspective. So over to you. Oh, can we hear you?
I just taken it off mute now.
Oh, good. Thank you.
But I don't know what was more impressive, Shona's presentation or the fact that my mum is always able to arrive at the door just as I'm about to start speaking on Zoom at something. So yeah, well done, Mum. Thanks very much. As you said there, my name's Martin and I'm the director at the Kinning Park Complex. Presentation slightly difficult today because I can't see all your faces, so I won't be able to read the room and know when my jokes are going down like a lead balloon. But for those of you that know me, people might think, well, there's no difference there, Martin. So Kinnan Park Complex, let me see if this is moving along. Yeah, who are Kinnan Park Complex? We are, as we said, was a community anchor organisation based in Glasgow, and our aims are the promotion of creativity, well-being, citizenship and community. And really our mission as an organisation is to develop assets and services that are both community owned and led. So what is it that we actually do? We own and operate the community's key local facility, and through that we hire out a range of artist studios, offices, event spaces, co-working spaces, and through that we're able to generate the income that we need to be able to invest in our social programmes. Our social programmes are mainly focused on the immediate neighbourhood, and they involve programmes to improve well-being, programmes to tackle social isolation and exclusion, and programmes to deal with community and personal development. Our track record we're quite proud of, as was said before. We were one of the first organisations to go forward with the Community Empowerment Act and buy out our centre. We bought that from City Property, which was a bit of a journey in itself, but it was also something that we were working through for the first time, pardon me, as were our colleagues in the ALIO. So, you know, a lot of learning all round. We are also now one of the first organisations to go forward with a local place plan. Since that, had some legislation brought in to support that as well. We decided to deliver a major capital project which kicked off in March 2020, which was great because, you know, delivering a major capital project during the pandemic is a fantastic learning experience. And we have a real strong track record of being a hub for social innovation and for new community projects and new social enterprises who tend to be based within our spaces before going on and taking other spaces and other areas as well, which, you know, doing some of the preparation for the slides today, I think it shines through how much other community landowners are the same, and that they provide an umbrella space under which new enterprises can develop and move on to improve the lives of their community. Just to tell you a little bit about our pandemic response, we developed a project called the AOK project. Because we were set up to deal with social exclusion, social isolation, health, well-being, community development, actually we were able to respond really quickly to the situation that has emerged. And as a small organisation, we were able to be much more nimble. And I think that really speaks to the benefits of having partnerships. You know, large public sector institutions are like an oil tanker, or they're like an aircraft carrier. It's very difficult for them to turn quickly. And when they do turn, if done in the wrong way, they can swamp everybody else. Smaller battleships or smaller boats alongside them as part of, let's say, our armada of community wealth building can perform a great role in scouting out new opportunities and also responding to new opportunities and threats. Our project over just the summer and the initial pandemic response period delivered 20 metric tonnes of food to local residents. We activated around 150 local volunteers. We could only work with around 60 of them every week, but what we did do was recruit and pass on volunteers to other organisations, again using our infrastructure to be able to support smaller grassroots organisations. We provided direct regular support to around 180 households, so much so that at one point the Red Cross was starting to come to us asking if we could help them deal with their capacity issues. And also our feedback, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on, was that as a small organisation with direct connection to our community organisations, we were much better able placed to respond to the needs of individual community members, you know, in the way that we would deliver food packs. Essentially, smaller organisations are more flexible and more nimble, and there isn't as much cost involved in them maintaining that direct relationship as, you know, as a diseconomies of scale that can sometimes come into play as well. And we were also able to leverage in our position as a community anchor organisation to secure £80,000 in central government funding to be able to pass out to smaller community groups, including refugee and migrant-led groups who simply wouldn't have had the legitimacy or the social capital to be able to bring in those funds. But actually, in the same way that we are not the institution when compared to a public body, in some ways we are an institution compared to smaller grassroots groups. And so they were much better placed to be able to deal with some of the specific needs for the other communities that they were serving as well. That response hasn't finished yet. We've kind of went into the long struggle of the winter, where we've continued to provide social isolation support over the phone, and also running face-to-face essential services for those who are most socially isolated. So during this whole thing, for people who live alone and have no family support, we've been able to run face-to-face essential services. That wouldn't have happened with larger organisations because it'd be more difficult for them to manage the risk as well. But so quite simply, we couldn't leave people who are alone and who have no family support and who wouldn't have seen somebody or anybody for months and months upon a time. So, it's been a difficult and challenging experience, but it's something that we're proud to have done. And we've continued to champion food dignity principles, because we know the people that are being given parcels, and we can invest the time in those relationships. We're able to give people things that they want rather than just random things that turn up at their house that they've got no intention of eating, and also erodes their dignity at the same time. And all the while we've been preparing for a building reopening. That's a kind of long introduction into what the point of this was supposed to be, where I was asked to prepare something around how can land in buildings bring value to community organisations. But I have to say I'm not going to do that, because I think the question's the wrong way around. I actually think it's community ownership that can bring value to the land in the buildings. And I think Community Land Scotland, a little bit outdated in 2013, but Community Land Scotland's done some amazing research on the rise in land values when they come into community ownership, and also the rise in turnover and the creation of jobs that community owners have been able to bring into their communities as well. So I really believe that community ownership adds value to the land and the buildings. It's not the other way around. So, there are very different formats of community ownership, and so I'm going to talk about something similar to Linda did, the way that Community Land Scotland describe it. So geographic community, open membership, democratic accountability, and non-profit distributing. So, this is probably the point at which I would love, if we were in a room and I had more time, to open it up to ask you what some of the thoughts that you have around community ownership. But I don't have the time, and I'm scared that you come up with things that I don't have a smart answer for. So, I'm not going to do that. So one of the things that we talk about is how community ownership, some people think it's just a trendy fad for hipsters. Now, obviously, the Western Isles is where Scotland's community land ownership really took off. And the preponderance for hipsters in Glasgow's West End to wear tweed means that I can certainly understand why people might get mixed up. There's also a thought that community ownership is just too risky to let people have control or ownership over real assets, that it's somehow niche, or it's just for the well-off communities as well. There is a thought that it is just councils giving away liabilities, and I think I'll speak a little bit more about that, but that myth is maybe a little bit more nuanced than the other ones. So in terms of surprising truths, 90 plus years of community ownership in Scotland, with the Stornoway Trust being the longest community landowner. And in that time, no community landowner has ever gone bankrupt, which is slightly better than the figures for the private industry. 3% of Scotland land is in community ownership. And there is a higher level of transfer requests from the most deprived communities as opposed to the most affluent communities in Scotland as well. And most acquisitions are not through community asset transfer, but they're through negotiated sales. So some of the facts and the figures around community ownership: 75% of the population of the Western Isles live on community land. If you really want to see how community land can be taken at full potential, you have to check out what some of the islands in Scotland have done, because they are leading the way. Urban communities really have to be inspired and learn from them. There are 590 assets owned by 419 groups, and generally there's a trend that the longer an organisation is around, it will start to develop more assets and purchase and take on more assets and more businesses as time goes on. There's 191,000 hectares of land in community ownership, which is around twice the size of Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dundee combined. Community landowners have been able to tackle some really thorny issues, and what I wanted to do quickly before finishing is to highlight some of the successes around a couple of key topics. So in urban regeneration, we have folks like the Mid-Steeple Quarter who are revitalising the high street, bringing in affordable housing, and the decline of the high street has been one of the most talked about issues over time in certain ways when it comes to economic development in towns. Yet Mid-Steeple Quarter are coming up with some really innovative and interesting ways to tackle that. We've got Linwood Community Development Trust, who were the Catherine Trebek and the We All Alliance have just done a case study on. I think they've managed to take their turnover up to around 2 million now, and they're currently developing a community centre, a cafe, a 3G pitch, a theatre, and a whole range of things to add to the number of businesses that they run at the moment. And of course, the Kinnan Park complex with a extremely intelligent and modest director. Then we have rural depopulation. So sometimes the numbers can seem quite small, but we have West Harris, who in percentage terms have increased their population by 30% in the last 10 years. We have the Island of Egg Trust, who have increased their population by 70% over the last 20 years, more or less, since the buyout. And smaller islands like Papa Westray, who may only be adding single figures to their population, or sometimes 20 or 30. But actually what we're talking about here is schools staying open, jobs staying on for the rest of the islanders. And so if we actually want to have any kind of rural communities, we have to learn some of the lessons that they've been doing there. And I think around, again, really tricky issues such as rural housing, there are community organisations that are able to build affordable housing, which is the first time that might have happened for 20 or 30 years within their community. And economic development and infrastructure as well, which is always something that I know a lot of the folks in the audience would be talking about. We have Machrihanish, who since been set up, I think this is a slightly outdated case study. It's about 5 years old, but at that time they had 212 full-time workers in the businesses that had moved into the area as a result of them developing business facilities. We can see here for the case study, 97% of their turnover generated by sales. Even the first 4 years of operation, able to return a profit. Some really interesting figures coming out of some of the community landowners. Galston Community Trust, who have £20 million in turnover from their community-owned renewables over the sort of period of 10 years after paying it off. Probably around half of that turnover they're expecting to be able to invest directly into community projects, so that they're now a funder. And the the chair of Galston would say, used to stay up at night worrying about the future of their community. Now she stays up at night worrying about how they can invest all the money that they've made from community-owned renewables. And so the investment and the growth and the economic output of community landowners doesn't stop there. I think Machrihanish, she said there that they'd spent, just in the first 4 years, they'd spent £700,000 on local companies. Tobermory on Mull, where there are a number of community landowners, where they own a diverse range of assets, run a range of different businesses. Or even just now, something that's been in the press and on social media in the last few days, 3 young folks from Rassay, I think all in their early 20s, that have just raised £600,000 in community shares to be able to invest in a community-owned renewables hydro system. They aim to be able to provide around 4%, hopefully, back to the investors, as well as reducing the prices of electricity for a population, 50% of whom live in fuel poverty. So again, whilst they're able to tackle some of the social issues, the fact that folks will be spending less of their money in electricity means that they'll be able to spend more money in other aspects of their life. So again, real tangible benefits. It's not all rosy. There are definitely challenges. At the minute, I would say that there's a tendency to think about transferring liabilities to community organisations. So not assets as such, not something which is expected to generate a surplus that can be reinvested, but community organisations mostly from a position of trying to keep things open, but also from what they're allowed to take over sometimes by public sector bodies for a certain, without wanting to describe it, or maybe could describe that slightly less clumsily, but there's a tendency to transfer liabilities to community organisations. And I think as we go forward with more community ownership, we have to be aware of that. We have to also let communities have a crack at owning and managing assets which have got real potential to generate economic surplus that can be reinvested. There's a lack of maturity and sophistication in the process, so that means that things are clunky. There's often a lack of understanding between, maybe public sector colleagues and community owners, and that needs time, and it needs projects, and it needs successes if that's to be worked through. In terms of the community owners themselves, there is a real need for investment in technology and skills, in the sector as well. At the same time as asking the sector to deal with really difficult problems that maybe the private sector or the public sector hasn't been able to solve, we're asking them to do that without the management capacity and the investment in infrastructure that might have been in other places as well. So I think we have to have a think about that. If we think back to the folks from RASI, £2 million investment could have 100 people from community organisations going through an MBA. Do we really think that they wouldn't be able to raise that kind of economic value and social impact over time? I think we have to think about how we can really upskill folks within community organisations as quickly and as deeply as possible.
I'm going to give you a 2-minute call, Martin. Is that okay?
Yeah, no worries. But just to say that there are a whole load of opportunities as well. Some of the partnerships that Shona hinted at could offer really exciting possibilities for the way that we tackle social issues and economic development in Scotland. And I think, one thing that we have to stress is that people in public sector bodies and people in community owners are working for the exact same outputs. They're working for the economic and social well-being of our communities, and being able to bring real partnership to that offers real possibility. We can start to tackle some of those wicked problems like climate change, like rural depopulation, like the decline of the high street if we start to create some of those partnerships. And we have the possibility to develop new models here that can be exported to other parts of Scotland and hopefully around Europe and around the world. And by working together, we can harness the collective power of our communities, both the human and the economic capital. And I think, the skills that we have in both the public and the third sectors in Scotland are absolutely fantastic. If we can start working together a little bit more in partnership, then, there's no telling how far we can go.
Martin, thank you. Is that you done?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. A huge array of examples there, and so much to think about, I think, and to contemplate. I think you're probably a little too modest on your own achievements there as well, but we'll maybe get you back to do some more on that one. Okay, so I'm just conscious of time, everybody, and we're going to take a short break, coming back about 3:25. Neil, will we do the overview of the workshops when people come back from the break? You happy to do that?
Yeah, let's just have a small comfort break of 2 or 3 minutes. Now, wasn't it fantastic? I thought really excellent set of presentations. So what we're going to do now, quite simply, is we're going to break out for, let's say, 10 minutes. We've got facilitators in each group. We're going to have 5 groups, and basically want you to come up with one question for our assembled. So you're all going to have a wee huddle, download what you've thought about, have a little conversation, and then the facilitator will harvest one question that we're then going to ask to the panelists. How does that sound? Yeah? Great. Right. Alison, take us away.
Okay, I've just started rooms, so you should have a button in front of you. And the breakout rooms have closed, Neil.
Oh, sorry. Right.
And I apologise if everyone was halfway through a sentence when I pulled you back.
I forgot we were in the main session, sorry. Right. Okay, over firstly to Isaac. What was the question you come up with, Isaac?
No.
Well, I'll go somewhere else. Ellie, have you got your question ready?
Yes. So the question we had is there a way to create a level playing field in policy to tackle the contradictions of what we're trying to achieve versus the reality of our current systems?
Hold on. Now, remember the 4 panelists are going to ask that. Say that again. Is there a way
to create a level playing field in terms of policy to tackle the contradictions of what we're trying to achieve with community wealth building versus the reality of the current systems we're working in?
Can you make that simple for me? Make that simple for me, Ellie. Is there a way to create a level playing field in policy?
In terms of policy to enable community wealth building approaches to develop.
Right, to enable community wealth building. Is there a way to create a level playing field in policy to enable community wealth building approaches to grow? Yeah. Good. Rachel.
I was going to hand over to Mary Patterson of North Ayrshire to ask our question.
Mary.
Hi, Neil.
Yeah.
Our question was, how do we get the word out to micro businesses around employee ownership and make it something that they can engage with as well and as meaningfully as the slightly larger businesses?
How do we get the word out to micro businesses to engage with employee ownership? That what, Mary?
Yeah.
Okay. Now remember, Martin, Linda, Simon, and Shona, you're going to have to answer these. So we've got: is there a way to create a level playing field in policy to enable community wealth building approaches to grow? How do we get word out to micro businesses to engage with employee ownership? And now, who else we go? Conrad.
Dave Brown is asking our question.
Good. Dave.
Hi there. Yeah, our question is around how do we move take up of these opportunities to the next level? Firstly, by increasing the capacity of community organisations to actually go through a complicated and involved process like this, but also to improve or sustain the culture of all parties involved around the transfers.
Say that again, Dave. It was good. How do we move take up to the next level? There was a culture point. What was the first?
Well, the first point, there were sort of two sides of the similar coin that have been merged into one by Conrad. But the first part of the question was more around the capacity within community organisations. You know, do they have the skills actually to take this through? Could they get support from other parties with pro bono type elements? But also then the other point was around the culture involved in all parties and the understanding, the acceptance, and the willingness to take these forward.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that group. So we've got how do we move take up to the next level with culture and capacity, and there's a little bit of more detail there. I'm sure the respondents are taking note. Isaac, back to you again.
Yeah, well, we had one question which is very similar to that around how does one give capacity, but we had another one which was a bit different, which was, you know, a big message which has come out of today is that this is changing the economic change is just as much about sharing power, and that requires getting people to work together. But as a process question, how do you manage this process of bringing all the stakeholders in and giving people a voice and fairly managing that complex process of sharing power with the council and local community organisations?
How do you manage power and getting different voices in? That okay, Isaac?
Absolutely.
Thanks, pal. And the group I was in was one thing the public sector could do to make it easier in terms of advancing employee ownership and different forms of land and property ownership. So we've got 5 questions there. What I'm just going to ask is for each of the respondents to speak. That's I'll go Linda, Simon, Shona, and Martin, and maybe give you 3 or 4 minutes each. I think we've got 3 minutes each, 3 or 4 minutes each on any of those particular questions that take your fancy. And I'm just going to go through them just to make it easy for you. Firstly, is there a way that locally, is there a way to create a level playing field in policy to enable community wealth building approaches to grow? Then we've got how do we get the word out to micro businesses to engage in employee ownership? Then we've got how do we move take up to the next level in terms of culture and capacity? How do we manage power and getting different voices in? And then there's the last one. What is the one thing that public sector could do to enable this agenda to grow even faster? So I'll start with Linda. And Linda, I'm not asking you, of course, to answer all those questions. Pick out one, or just one that sparks your interest, or talk to 2 or 3 of them, whatever you wish. But you've got 3 or 4 minutes to kind of give your reply. Linda, you there?
Yes, I am.
Fire on.
Okay, I will pick up the question on taking it to the next level about community capacity and the culture in communities in the public sector. I was actually in the breakout group that were kind of forming that question, and I think our experience of asset transfer and community ownership across Scotland is that communities are reacting primarily they're reacting to a threat. So, it's the threat of the closure of a facility, the loss of services, the kind of that sort of impact which drives. So when a local authority announces it's closing its public halls, we will pick up a kind of significant kind of rush of communities looking to take those halls on. I think in a post-COVID world, there's certainly signs that there are going to be significant surplus assets, both publicly, which are subject to asset transfer requests, and also privately. And I think the challenge and a kind of area of focus has to be how to help communities rationalise what they should be taking on. So we should be coming forward proactively to assist in the rationalising of what actually are assets and what are liabilities and what best suits their needs. In terms of capacity within communities, I mean, Martin kind of touched on it. It was also picked up in our group. We did research in Glasgow, and the majority, 67% of all our inquiries came from the most disadvantaged communities in the group, in the city, the top 20% most disadvantaged. And the reality is they're the ones most affected by changes in public sector provision. Their ability to move through the process, there are kind of support requirements. So the issues round about providing communities with additional professional support requirements is something that kind of needs to be looked at. But in reality, what they want to do with that, capacity rests within communities about what they want to do with these assets. So it's just about kind of ensuring that the kind of more technical side of things that they may not necessarily have access to can be delivered. So being proactive, helping communities be strategic, and actually just bringing professional support services into communities, I would say, for that kind of third question.
Spot on, Linda. I think that's really good responses to those couple of questions. And I think what we're talking about here is the progressive and the kind of quite the systemic change we're talking about here, because we say community wealth building is the new economic development mainstream. So in that, what we're saying is, why are we not putting as much energy into this sort of stuff as we would on inward investment or other forms of what is seen as traditional type of economic development and growth? And in that, you would do quite a lot of significant planning. It can't be reacting to a problem. You're actually planning a well-being, decent economy with a forethought. And I think that's key, and that includes capacity, but it also includes that pipeline of the kind of where we're moving to. So I think that's really quite telling your answer there, and also I think it's gives us a little feel for the ambition in terms of what we're trying to achieve with community wealth building. Simon, to you, I mean, there's one obvious question I felt, but you may want to take that one, which is about how do we get word out to microbusinesses engage with employee ownership? And I'm sure you're doing a good job of it, wheeled out by Scottish Enterprise, I'm sure. But take that one, but any other ones you want to kind of talk to, please, Simon.
Yeah, no, I think it's probably best if I take that one because I'm going to have the most knowledge on it. I mean, an initial, straight away in one of the opening slides, I think it might have been one of yours, Neil, there was the Scotland for Employee Ownership was mentioned at the end. So that's a Scottish Government initiative to try and move the number of employee-owned firms to 500 by 2030, which is quite an ambitious target. And there is some money behind it. It's not a great deal of money. There was enough money to have an administrative post for a period. That's stopped at the moment, just COVID and other constraints. But we had and we still have, it's a little bit inactive at the moment, we had 3 groups of people who are experts in employee ownership, mostly people from employee-owned businesses, whether they be vendors or whether they be advisors or whether they be people who are employees, who understood how it worked. And we're trying to get together to say, how can we raise the profile of employee ownership in Scotland? That has made progress. It's been a bit, I say, stuttery over the last year. We had about a year before that where we were forming ideas and looking at ways we could raise the profile. There are obvious ones. There are advisors out there who are talking to businesses all the time, whether they be accountants, lawyers, financiers, whatever they are, who have an interest in businesses often moving into another phase, and it's been able to educate those individuals that employee ownership is a real and possible opportunity. So that's something I've done with Scottish Enterprise. We did a talk going back a couple of years ago where we did 40 people in the morning, 40 in the afternoon, one in Glasgow, one in Edinburgh, where we talked to people from the finance sector and said, when you're talking to your clients, this is something you should really be considering. So on that side, yes, there's work going on. There could always be more work going on. We're also looking, again, through Scotland for EO, at all the other organisations which are out there talking to small businesses, the FSB, the Chamber of Commerce. There's the foundations which represent family firms, and it's trying to set up a dialogue with those to allow us to put the information across in a way that people can understand it in their day-to-day business dealings. Not everybody is thinking about business succession when they should be, so it's trying to make people think about that and then see employee ownership as a really good opportunity for them. I personally, I'd like to see it talked about more at a government level, and I probably get a bit blinkered, and I think, why aren't the government talking about this? The government have got hundreds of things to talk about. I say, why aren't they talking about employee ownership? I see it as ticking lots of boxes from the economic side. I spoke last year at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance conference before lockdown back at Edinburgh University in January, I think it was. Nicola Sturgeon spoke in the morning and gave the keynote speech and committed herself as much as she could do at that stage to well-being being one of the central pillars of economic policy for years to come. I was one of the speakers in the afternoon, and I'd like to think that people at the top of government really do understand the benefits of employee ownership, and the more they mention it as an option for business, then the more it will become reality, because people become more aware of it. So I'd love to be able to see a little bit more pressure put on some of the senior people in government who, even if they just mention it and mention the benefits of it, and then suddenly its profile becomes much higher. So we're trying from all different angles, and I know there is efforts being made to try and influence people at a senior level to really make it happen.
Yeah, and arguably the whole gamut of things within inclusive ownership models need to be seen as the mainstream, and I think there is a culture there, isn't there? Yeah. Very well done. Thank you for that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Shona, any of those questions that took your fancy?
A couple of them.
Oh, fire on then. Fire on. Can't see you. Can't see you, Shona. Can't hear you now either. Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Okay, I'll maybe pick up on the first one, which I think was, I think it was actually, can we create a level playing field? And I think the simple answer to that is yes. The more complicated bit of it is how, and I think that there's probably lots of things that we could and should do. But just to highlight a couple, I think the first thing I would highlight would be the role of the SPFM, so Scottish Public Finance Manual, which is that bit of guidance that's come up in our group. It's that bit of guidance that public bodies have to follow when they're making decisions about selling land or other assets. And I keep hearing people say that the guidance restricts public bodies to charging it basically equates best value to highest price. Now, I'm not convinced that it is as simple as that, but I'm not an expert on the guidance. But actually, regardless whether it is or isn't, we clearly need to look at the guidance to make sure that it isn't, and people aren't just seeking highest price. So, and actually, that was one of the recommendations that was made through the task force. So, we've kind of made that suggestion to government already. The second thing I think we could helpfully look at would be capital gains tax, and the reason I'm highlighting that one is that my understanding is that if you're a landowner and your land is purchased through compulsory purchase regulations, which are the regulations that are used for community buyouts, then you're exempt from capital gains tax. But if you negotiate a voluntary sale to a community group, then you're not exempt, and yet you would have to pay the capital gains tax. Now that clearly creates a bit of an perverse incentive for landowners to hold off and actually go through the full process, which is time consuming and difficult. So that would seem to be an obvious one. Just looking at the other questions, I'll maybe pick up on the one about communities and capacity, because this comes up all the time, and of course there are issues around about communities and capacity, because most communities of operations and businesses and community ownership organisations are staffed by volunteers, So they're not going to have the same sort of professional skills and expertise and experience that professionals working in that field would have. So yeah, I think there's always going to be a need for support. What surprises me a little bit is that actually, if we were talking about any other sector, you know, if we were talking about tourism, if we were talking about biotech or talking about education, the government doesn't think twice about supporting sectors on a sectoral basis. But yet when we're talking about communities, somehow that seems to be different. So there's something to me, we kind of need to change our attitude, I think, a little bit to actually what is a sector. And I'll maybe just pick up briefly on the final question, because it's a bit of a personal bugbear of mine, actually. What can the public sector do differently? There's a couple of things that immediately spring to mind. One is, I really wish we could stop strategizing. Everybody wants to be strategizing in the public sector instead of doing. And if we paid more people to do and less people to strategize, I think we would get a long way. And the second bit is actually, and maybe it's a bit of a technical point, but it relates to how people are paid in the public sector and how our pay scales are determined. And the two things that tend to be really important are how many people you're the boss of and how much money you control. So actually what we're saying here is we want people to collaborate. We want people to be good at collaborating. So wouldn't it be a good idea actually to base people's salary on how good they are at collaborating instead?
No, that's fantastic. I'm glad we're recording this from your contributions, but everyone else's, because there was some great stuff in there. And the financial resume struck home to me, particularly in terms of trying to change the dial on that. I mean, it's fundamental to well-being economics. We need to get a financial spending patterns that support that. So thanks for that. And last but not least, Martin, are you there, Martin? Is anyone that took your fancy? And we've got maybe squeezed your time a wee bit there, but you got
I'll go on
2.5 minutes. Fire on.
Whistle stop tour. I feel sadly that I might be the Grinch in this situation, which is bad, because I think that's usually Neil's job. But you know, around the level playing field, what can we do to have a level playing field to address the structural inequalities that we've got just now? Well, there's something, tax, for example, would be one thing, but you know, and the other thing would be investment. So investment in community organisations and levelling the investment, very much like Shona said. You know, if we start investing the amount of money into community organisations and community owners as we would in the private sector, then maybe the community ownership sector will start to see similar levels of results. Where do you want to invest that money? Well, you want to invest that money in the exact same places you invest that at the usual times. You want to invest it in human capital, you want to invest it in infrastructure and process, and you want to invest it in physical assets. You know, how do we increase the capacity? Whilst I kind of agree with Linda's points, it's good to get, you know, skills into community organisations that they might not normally have. I don't want it to be all pro bono, not really interested in other people's hand-me-downs. I don't want it to become a big gravy train for consultants. What we want to do is we want to invest in management leadership in the community ownership sector or in the community sector. So we're talking about qualifications, we're talking about master's degrees, we're talking about MBAs. I mean, that's where you want. That's where how you invest capacity, of course. And we also want to allow them to invest in technology and invest in their management. You know, it's all often talked about how much of your percentage has been given. You know, you're never allowed to say actually what we want here is £20,000 for a new EPOS system. You know, where's the funding for community organisations for that? So how come we expect community organisations to be able to tackle problems which are more complex and difficult without the tools that the private sector could do it with? To my mind, it's a little bit crazy. In terms of processes around power sharing, you know, you can't give people power. You know, if you give people power, you can take it away. You know, and so at the end of the day, we need to invest in. So Galson, that I talked about earlier on, when they came to the table with their own money and their own resources, then they were partners with the local authority. They could start saying no, because power is when you can say no and you're not beholden to doing what other people want. Power means that you can choose what it is that you want to do. So we can help community organisations build revenue generating assets, and then that will help them have the power to do what it is that they want to do. And around what's the one thing that the public sector can do? This is where I feel like the Grinch. There is no one thing. There's no magic bullet. Just like, you know, I wish there was a wee pill that I could take that would make my lockdown winter paunch belly disappear, but you can't. There's lots of things that need to be done, and it takes hard work and it takes commitment across a number of different fields. But if there is one broad theme, it's about partnership. So if local authorities, for example, want to start thinking about how they're going to approach community asset transfers, if they start doing that in a silo and they don't do it alongside community organisations, then they are not sharing the power. You know, they're holding on to this power as well. So actually creating real partnerships across the different sectors is the only way that we can do that. And that's not one simple thing. That's going to take time. There's going to be mistakes, but we need to start that process. So get on with it and try and do the difficult tasks.
Brilliant. Martin, that's fantastic, and sorry for rushing you a bit. And it makes me think that an edited highlights of all the things we've got from the recordings would be a great thing for EDAS to do. Maybe we can think about that. That was fantastic there. I'm conscious of time. We've run over. My fault. Liz, any final comments before we depart? Liz, over to you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Just again, you know, a really engaging session today. I think so much material, so much in terms of, you know, content. As you say, Neil, I think it would be, I don't know what we can do, but we'll look into that in terms of like trying to kind of pull a lot of this together, because we're now in our 4th session and all of them has been kind of building in terms of engagement. I just want to say thank you to obviously Neil, your team, Linda, Simon, Shona and Martin, obviously for taking out your time, busy days. I know you all have, so thank you so much for participating. To Lane and Alison in the background who've obviously been arranging all of this and giving all the kind of technical support. To everyone who's come along today, obviously for all your participation, your comments. We would really love feedback on how things are going so far. We've got another session coming up. The next one is the 17th of March. That same time, 2 till 4. We're shaping up the agenda for that, but we're looking at sort of procurement and financial instruments, you know, as in terms of our focus for that day. But would really like your feedback in terms of what you think we might still want to cover. But also we're thinking, we don't think this is the end, you know, in terms of what we're doing here. So in terms of shaping up EDAS's programme going forward, we'd really like your thoughts on, we've got thoughts, but we'd like to have your thoughts as well as to what that might look like. So, you know, I don't really want to keep people, because you're right, Neil, we've kind of slightly run over. Not very much though. I think it's been worth it for the content that we've had today. Really fantastic session, everybody, and really hope to see you all back again on the 17th of March. So thank you. Take care, everyone, in the meantime.